tell us what the current developments have been in Latin America in general, and also as related to the pandemic response. And if you want to start with Venezuela, what's happening with the coup attempt, how are things shaking out?
Well, 2019 was the year of several coups. The first one was in Venezuela, as you say, beginning in January. And then there was another one toward the end of the year in Bolivia. And there was also a large amount of continuing strife in Nicaragua. So what happened in Venezuela is the National Assembly, which is the legislature, is currently controlled by opposition parties. That is, parties that are in opposition to the governing party, who is called the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, though is known colloquially as the Chavistas. The U.S. has always been very opposed to the Chavista government for a number of reasons, partly because it has brought more of the economy, or rather the oil wealth, has used it for social spending and has brought it more into government control as opposed to being more governed by the private sector. It's also pushed for regional integration and promoted regional organizations that provide a counterbalance to U.S. power in Latin America. So the first coup against Venezuela was actually as far back as 2002, which failed. And ever since then, there's been a destabilization campaign orchestrated by the United States and internal political allies within Venezuela. The election of Donald Trump meant that the U.S. was now going to use more aggressive tactics to try to change the government. And the importance of Florida as a swing state, believe it or not, is a big factor because there is a large Venezuelan expatriate community, particularly in South Florida. So in 2019, the president of the National Assembly, it's done on a rotation basis amongst the majority parties, rather. And a very young man named Juan Guaido, who is about 35 years old and belongs to the most far right of all of the opposition parties, calls itself First Justice, I believe, became the new head of the National Assembly. And even though he had only won his election with about 26% of the vote, he was a virtual unknown. And came from the third smallest state in Venezuela by population. And nevertheless, the U.S. decided that this would be their guy, that they wanted to recognize as the new president of Venezuela, or the interim president as they were calling him. And they predicated this on allegations that the last presidential election, won by the Chavista candidate Nicolas Maduro, was fraudulent. What had in fact happened is that the U.S. had advised or really called on the major opposition parties to boycott the vote. And the boycotting would have the effect that the Chavista candidate would win by a huge landslide. Then they would be able to claim that that is itself evidence that the process has been rigged. Even though Venezuela has an independent body called the CNE, which presides over all of the elections, is bipartisan in nature, and the opposition parties even use the CNE themselves to preside over their internal party elections. Anyway, Juan Guaido announced himself to be interim president in January 2019. The U.S. instantly recognized him as the legitimate leader, as did all of the U.S.'s major allies in Europe, including Britain, France, etc. though there was a bit more division in Southern Europe for reasons that I don't want to get too into because they're a bit complex. All of the US's major Latin American allies did likewise. Colombia, Brazil, of course, Ecuador, unfortunately, and a few others. The majority, and they were grouped together in this organization called the Lima Group. And though did have some notable exceptions. I think Mexico remained neutral and Uruguay remained neutral. And what the U.S. hoped would happen was that the military, or large swaths of the military, would defect to Juan Guaido's side, and that there would be a civic military overthrow of the government, and Juan Guaido would then be installed as the new U.S.-friendly government in Venezuela.
Can we go back to the Florida thing? So you said there's a lot of expats there, and from my experience at the Venezuelan embassy, the people that were protesting against the embassy occupiers were, I think, very right-wing and very, very aggressive. Are those the people that Donald Trump was trying to please?
Yes, absolutely. The issue of the Venezuelan expatriates, overwhelmingly the Venezuelans who have left the country and moved to the United States and to other places. There's some in Spain. There are Venezuelans in other Latin American countries. They are disproportionately from the upper middle class. In part, that's because they can afford to leave. It's also to do with political orientation. So there is a huge amount of expatriates living in Florida who are not representative of the Venezuelan, they're not even representative of their own social group, let alone wider Venezuelan society. And so there is a temptation on the part of both parties, Republican and Democrat, to try to court this vote, given that Florida is such a crucial swing state. And and this has manifested itself in various ways. One of Trump's cronies, I think it was John Bolton, went and gave this barnstorming speech somewhere in Miami that was served as the Freedom Tower during the Cuban Revolution and all the people that left Cuba for Miami. And he came up with this term, the Troika of Tyranny, which was Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and announced that the U.S. was going to have a very robust, as he calls it, in other words, a very aggressive stance against these countries, including sanctions, particularly against Nicaragua, strengthening the embargo, which has lasted for however many decades now. And obviously, though he didn't say it at the time, this was included the coup strategy that I believe was about 6 months after he gave that speech. It is very sort of unique in U.S. Latin American relations that a coup has failed so decisively. What happened is that the military stayed very loyal to the government. There were very few defections to Guaido's side. And the coup attempt just became more and more desperate and more bizarre and ridiculous as time has gone by. So this year, for example, there's been a sea incursion by a group of mercenaries, including 2 American citizens, who tried to take a boat from Colombia and invade by sea to topple the government. This, of course, failed. I think about 8 of the mercenaries were killed. Several more were captured. The U.S. claims that it had nothing to do with it, though there are, and the Guaido faction claims that it had nothing to do with it, though there have been recordings that were leaked that strongly imply that this was done at the behest of the Guaido faction in Venezuela. I think what's particularly damning and what really shows the extent to which the coup has crumbled is that the more moderate opposition parties have signed a peaceful coexistence pact with the government and broken with the strategy of Juan Guaido. So he is now an even more isolated figure. He is a sort of almost an embarrassment to the U.S. now. I think that they're not even calling him the interim president anymore. And his party is no longer has the speakership or whatever it is of the National Assembly. It's rotated to one of the other opposition parties. So I think that the whole thing has failed. It's kind of blown over. Elections will go ahead as normal in Venezuela, and I think that the Chavistas may well, in spite of an admittedly very serious economic crisis, may well win the election again, because the Chavistas have a huge amount of support within the Venezuelan public, and you would never think that if you read the U.S. corporate-owned mainstream media. And the biggest proof of that fact is the way that opposition speakers themselves talk when they're talking to a Venezuelan audience. When they're talking to a U.S. audience, they'll say, oh, Chavez was a dictator, he was a caudillo, all this sort of thing, that Maduro isn't incompetent, that this is like a totalitarian dictatorship that we're living under. But when they're talking to a Venezuelan audience, they'll say things like, oh, I'm the true heir of Chavez. Henrique Capriles said something like that, and Juan Guaido also said something like that when he was talking to a Venezuelan audience. And they'll say things like, oh, Nicolas Maduro, he's kind of like a, what's the word? He's like a false prophet. He's like a heretical version of Chavismo, and we're the real Chavistas. And the reason they say that is because they know that they couldn't win an election, or at least a fair election, unless they bring at least a segment of the Chavista-leaning public over to their side, because their core support is a minority of the Venezuelan population, because historically the majority of the Venezuelan public has been poor, black, indigenous, mixed race, or some permutation of the above, whereas the political faction that they represent is, upper middle class and overwhelmingly of exclusively European ancestry. So it's likely that the status quo in Venezuela will maintain, and that the coup strategy will just kind of become more and more of a kind of sideshow. So it's over, and that has huge implications for U.S. power in the region and globally, because this is supposed to be the U.S.'s backyard, Latin America is, and they've failed to change the regime to a friendly government, even there, and even in a country which has been suffering under a huge economic crisis since about 2014. So it's very interesting. I think that it shows the extent to which the U.S. is an empire that's in decline.
My understanding is that Maduro had to leave the office, was in exile, and Guaido was running the show for a while. Is that not true?
No. Guaido never seized the reins of the state. He never took control over the major apparatus of the state. He was never in control of the military or the other parts of the state security forces. He never had any real executive power. He was sort of like a shadow government.
Okay, so is there anything else? Are you complete with Venezuela?
Yeah, we can. I'd be happy that this would be a good time to move on to Cuba.
Okay.
But what specifically would you like me to talk about?
Well, I know they've been under an embargo for decades, and that actually they have used that in a very intelligent way, and that they've become actually more sustainable than many other countries because of that. And so, as I said, Obama did try to normalize relations. He opened the Cuban embassy here in D.C. And did Donald Trump reverse that or partially reverse that?
He partially. So that, yeah, the renormalization with Obama is a good place to start. The embargo dates back to the 1950s. In fact, strictly speaking, as bizarre as it might sound, the embargo arguably predates even the Cuban Revolution. And that had been strengthened and strengthened and strengthened to the point that it was an economic blockade. It was there was even it was even to the extent where third countries were being penalized for having anything to do with Cuba, for trading with Cuba. It's cost the Cuban economy billions and billions. I think, in fact, one estimate puts the loss to the Cuban economy at over $100 billion over the decades. It's led to a huge amount of poverty. It's affected people's quality of life, standard of living, obviously. It's been denounced by many major international NGOs, including very mainstream NGOs. Every year since, I believe, the early 90s, the UN General Assembly has voted on a motion to condemn the embargo against Cuba. Every year it's passed with a majority. And the last time, I believe that you had something like 189 countries voting in favor of the motion to condemn it, and 2 voting against it, which was, no prizes for guessing who, the US and Israel. And I think there were 2 abstentions.
Yeah.
So that you have the whole world on one side, the US and Israel on the other. Now, Obama, toward the end of his second term, announced that he was going to renormalize diplomatic relations. You mentioned the embassy. So now Cuba has an embassy in Washington. The United States has an embassy in Havana. Before that, there was just an interests section because diplomatic relations were completely broken off, even though the U.S. had diplomatic relations with all but another 4 countries in the world, which shows how ridiculous it was. But it's important to keep in mind, however, that the embargo was never ended by Obama. The embargo is still in place. When Trump got elected, as I said, as with Venezuelan expatriates, there's an even bigger community of Cuban expatriates and their descendants living particularly in South Florida, though also in other parts of the United States. And they are overwhelmingly from the upper middle class, very opposed to the revolution, and tend to vote Republican, historically at least. So Trump wanted to court that part of the population, and so he promised to roll back parts of Obama's normalization. However, he only partially rolled it back. There are still flights to Cuba, so he did kind of half measures. So, for example, he stopped flights to all of Cuba's provincial cities, but allowed flights to continue to Havana. So you have this kind of gray area where the renormalization is, but at the same time, the sanctions that make up the embargo are still very much in force, and if anything, have been strengthened since Trump entered the White House.
And what about Guantanamo? Are the politics around that part of the equation?
Not really. That's a very strange situation. The U.S., as I'm sure you know, but maybe your viewers might benefit from this, that Guantanamo is sort of an occupied part of Cuba that belongs to the United States, where they have this detention center, of course, and it's an agreement that I think predates the Cuban Revolution. It was, and Fidel Castro famously never cash the checks that he received from the US as the sort of rent for that land, which the US continued to send throughout all the years of the revolution and the embargo. I think that what's interesting about Guantanamo Bay, firstly, is that it shows the hypocrisy of the situation. In fact, hypocrisy is maybe even too light a term, because Cuba, which is subjected to this blockade, which is vilified in the US press, vilified by the US government, ever since the revolution, it's never invaded another country. It's actually done many positive things on the world stage, for example, with its medical solidarity. Its human rights record is not perfect, but isn't even the worst in Latin America, let alone worst in the world. Yet the United States, which has, invaded countless countries over the decades, is always starting wars, has about, 4 to 5 wars going on at the moment, has military bases, hundreds of them all over the world, and yet it has the nerve to claim that it has moral credibility when it comes to passing judgment and issuing punitive measures on other states. And the occupation of Guantanamo is a microcosm of that, but is a particularly cruel irony, given that it's an occupation in Cuba, all Cuban territory.
And speaking of irony, this is a little bit off, but I think it's related, is the recent harsh measures in Portland, even what happened here in DC, as far as, rubber bullets being shot at peaceful protesters because the president wanted to take a selfie. And then all the military in Portland, all the burnings of around the country. Do you think, in your view, on the political stage, has that burst some of the bubble of moral superiority?
You mean amongst the public, the wider public?
The wider international public, or even leaders. I mean, I can't imagine leaders would be so naive to believe it ever. But as far as the public, who aren't privy to the knowledge,
that's quite a complex question. I think there are a number of distinctions you need to make between the U.S. public, the U.S. mainstream corporate media, the U.S. political class, and then the global public, media in other countries, and the international community. Because the U.S. internally, I think there's an overwhelming, pervading view that the U.S. is the good guy on the world stage, that it has an exemplary human rights record, both internationally and internally. I think the US media has been very successful in manufacturing consent for US empire by promulgating this point of view. On the international stage, things are very different. I think there have been polling done that find that in most countries, the public, the majority of the public, considers the United States to be the major threat to world peace. And that's true even in places in Europe, which are ostensibly US allied countries. So in terms of these latest rounds of protest in Portland, I think it's just a microcosm of the US's double standards and its hypocrisy in terms of treating other states. I mean, like, you have to think in the early 1960s, when the US imposed the embargo on Cuba, I mean, that was sort of like the tail end of Jim Crow. So here you have a country which is practicing apartheid effectively within its own borders, and then yet is moralizing on the global stage about a overthrow of a very corrupt government in a tiny Caribbean island nation, which by the way, the Batista regime dictatorship was brutal and was very tied with the American world of organized crime. And so I just see it as the latest example of the absurdity and the lack of credibility that the US has. And I think that it's also interesting when you look at it in terms of the political spectrum in the US. I would say the Republicans take the view that the US is great both internationally and internally. The Democratic Party takes the view that sort of, the US, is kind of good on the world stage, but it's kind of bad on the world stage, but, internally sort of sometimes is an okay human rights record. It's like the narrowness is really incredible. But the reality, of course, is the U.S. has a terrible record both internationally and domestically. It has the world's most prisoners in spite of only 4% of the population, and I could go on and on and on and on and on. But if you were to ask someone in Latin America, I don't think that this latest heavy-handed response in Portland is really telling them anything that they don't already know.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and then we were going to talk about the U.S. Effect on these countries, and you have talked about that with Venezuela, and you've talked about that with Cuba. Do you want to also talk about Nicaragua?
Yeah, well, Nicaragua is a very interesting case. I don't want to go too much into the history because it's quite long, but to give a very little snapshot, there was a armed revolution in the late 1970s, I believe, led by what were called the Sandinistas. They through a U.S.-backed dictatorship called the Somoza dictatorship and began a program of literacy campaigns and improving ordinary people's lives, social investment, all that sort of good stuff. Which was an affront to the U.S. because it threatened its interests in the country. So Reagan launched essentially a dirty war and backed a very vicious paramilitary organization called the Contras, which waged a ruthless campaign to try to topple the Nicaraguan government of Daniel Ortega. Now, Nicaragua continued to have elections during this time. It's like when you're a leftist government in Latin America, you can't win. If you don't have elections, you're told that you're a dictatorship. If you have elections, they're rigged, unless of course the U.S.'s preferred party wins. The opposition, the right-wing opposition, won an election, I think about roughly a decade into the Sandinista revolution, and they governed. But then the Sandinistas won back power democratically several years later. And the U.S. has been singling out Nicaragua in the region because it doesn't like its government. In the last few years, it's really tightened things up. It's tightened the thumb screws. It's passed something called the NICA Act, which targets the president and his wife, targets various other politicians that the U.S. doesn't like, and is really having a detrimental effect, on the country. Obviously, in a similar way to sanctions against Cuba, but in spite of this, and in spite of a sort of mini coup in 2018, I believe, the government is still in power, and things seem to have calmed down. It was another U.S. failure. The media has completely misrepresented the situation, It's claimed that there are a lot more political prisoners than there actually are. It's misrepresented the reasons why people are being detained. I mean, it's not publicizing the good things that Nicaragua has done. For example, it's the only country, I think, in the entire Western Hemisphere that is entirely food sovereign.
Yeah.
That it grows all of its own food, but it's again a similar situation to Venezuela. And it's a sign of the U.S.'s decline as a major world power and its inability to really impose its will anymore, because people have realized that if you have people power, if you have social movements, if you have electoral strength, the poor and the marginalized in the developing world can stand up to U.S. empire and win and build better societies in the face of the hugest adversity that you could possibly think of. So in a way, it's encouraging. In a way, it's a positive sign, but at the same time, the U.S. is still able to inflict a huge amount of damage, even when it's losing, of which Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba are prime examples.
And as far as the global pandemic and all the measures that are being taken in all of these countries, how is that affecting Latin American countries?
Oh, it's having a devastating effect. And interestingly, the countries that are sort of sometimes held up as the major success stories are the ones that are where people are suffering the most. And even the mainstream U.S. press is publicizing this. There was a two-part investigation in the New York Times on what's going on in Colombia, where you are having huge amounts of unemployment, which is leading to homelessness. A lot of women are being pushed into prostitution to just to survive.
Because of the pandemic, there's going to be, like you said, there's a lot of unemployment, poverty. The U.S. continues with all of its incursions, all of its embargoes, which is just making things even worse. Do you have a prediction in how things are going to shake out in the next year or so regarding Latin America and the U.S.'s relationship with them?
Whoa, that's a huge question, and there are many facets to that question. I'll try to be comprehensive and brief at the same time. Of course, the first thing I would say is that it would be naive to think that there'll be a great deal of difference if Trump is out of the White House. Joe Biden comes from the sort of Clintonite, New Democrat, corporate establishment wing of his party. Of course, he served as vice president during the Obama administration, which was, with a few minor exceptions, overwhelmingly dreadful on Latin American policy. So I wouldn't put much hope into a Biden presidency radically changing things in terms of the U.S. role. As for what I see going forward internally in Latin America, it's very difficult to say. On the one hand, there's this idea of the shock doctrine that I'm sure you've heard of, disaster capitalism, that very often capitalist interests use crises as a way to reestablish their power and their tentacles into society in the aftermath of a major crisis. Naomi Klein, in her book, she gives examples like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and so on. I think there's a real risk of that phenomenon playing out all across the region, especially in places where you have right-wing governments that will be all too happy to facilitate that process. On the other hand, one could argue that this crisis has made all people, wherever they live, realize how fragile human societies can be. I think that it's completely obliterated so many of the neoliberal and even social Darwinistic assumptions that lie behind our current economic and social paradigms. Like, I mean, a classic is this idea, this neoliberal idea that all unemployment is voluntary. I mean, you and I knew that that was always ridiculous. But I mean, it's being like, even a madman could not claim that now. It's obvious that unemployment is, at least in part, caused in large part by, social and economic forces. And so I think that it's led in a way to people thinking, oh, well, we do need social protections like unemployment protection, because it could happen to anybody unless you're independently wealthy. It's also led to the realization that public services are important, that the countries that have implemented the most social democratic reforms tend to have done a lot better in terms of managing the pandemic than the countries that have spent the last few decades sipping the neoliberal Kool-Aid have, particularly the US, where both major parties, are completely enamored with this idea that the so-called free market is the solution to all of humanity's problems. I mean, that's now clearly not the case. Yeah. But on the other hand, it's important not to underestimate the ability of the mass media and the major cultural organs of capitalist society to build and manufacture public consent for the status quo. I think that's really the blind spot that the left has had for not just decades, but for centuries. There was a very brilliant Italian political theorist called Antonio Gramsci, who came up with this idea of cultural hegemony. And his idea was that the ruling class in capitalism maintains its power not primarily through violence, but through dominating society's major cultural and communication forces to build consent even amongst people for whom it's not in their interests. If you just allow me one final thought on that, is that people who oppose the status quo, such as myself and yourself, I'm sure as well, we have a few more tools than existed in ages gone by. We have social media, we have the internet, which has which of course, is dominated by large multinational corporations like Facebook. But on the other hand, it does give a bit more ability to have opposing views and to publish and so on. So we're sort of at a crossroads, and a big part of this will be how the world of communication pans out. What things like net neutrality are going to be crucial in this. Things about media reform will be crucial, about how we regulate the major big tech companies like Facebook and Google. There was recently something in Australia to try to have them pay the media outlets that they are publishing. So that that is really, I think, the nexus of all of this. That like this thing about cancel culture, it's no coincidence that right-wing forces are making a fuss about them allegedly being, you know, victimized by a morally certain left at this point in human history. That's not a coincidence at all. So yeah, the big takeaway I would have is in many ways it's up to us to forge how the future will look in terms of all these things. There have been some interesting developments over the last few days, in fact, that show that the U.S.'s credibility and influence is declining. Like the former president of Colombia, Alvaro Uribe, was arrested just the other day on charges of trying to bribe witnesses. The people in the capital city of Bogota were celebrating, banging, pots and pans against walls and streets and things like that, because there's a feeling like the impunity isn't quite what it was. People are starting to clue up a little bit. The hypocrisy is starting to become more obvious. So, for example, the United States predicates its regime change program in Venezuela on allegations of the Venezuelan government being involved in narco trafficking. Now, I certainly think that these allegations are dubious at best. But even if we, for the sake of argument, say that they were true, it still would not be a reason. It still wouldn't mean that the U.S. has any credibility, because during the entire presidency of Alvaro Uribe, between 2002 and 2010, the U.S. was not only turning a blind eye. Not only were there no punitive measures whatsoever, he was being armed to the teeth and given billions of dollars through Plan Colombia, even though the U.S.'s own intelligence documents, recently declassified from the 90s, described him as a close personal friend of Pablo Escobar, who was coordinated with the Medellin cartel at high government levels, that a fellow senator had accused the Medellin cartel of bankrolling his campaign for the Senate, Uribe's campaign for the Senate in the 1990s. And just recently, the Venezuelan foreign minister has produced some photos of him with a major Mexican drug trafficker. So, and then of course, because of the internet, anyone who wishes to can find this stuff out. So what we're seeing, I think what we're witnessing in the present day is a sort of collapse of the intellectual edifice on which the U.S. builds its regime change, or rather the justification for its regime change strategy. It's just it's like people are realizing the emperor has no clothes. So and you have some wins, you have some losses. Bolivia, sadly, the coup was very successful. Evo Morales was exiled to Mexico. The right wing, whose name I forget, is now president, even though she didn't even run and got less than her party got less than 5% in the election. But the fact that we have people like Glenn Greenwald and publications like The Intercept means that people can check things for themselves if they're so inclined. And the fact that the OAS report that claimed fraudulence in the first place was discredited is now a lot more widely known than would have been the case had this coup happened before the internet had existed. So it's been a game changer in that respect, and I think that if new elections are held, Evo Morales' party, it won't be him himself, but the candidate from his party, I think, in all likelihood, would win. It's a mixed picture, but I think what's changed is more, contextual factors, like the internet and things like that have. So I'm optimistic to some extent about Latin America. There being a more respectful, not with Trump in the White House, obviously, but the U.S. has to come to terms with the fact that people in Latin America aren't going to allow themselves to be pushed around anymore, and that can only be viewed as a positive thing.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you.
My pleasure.